Hello and welcome to this installment of the University of New Mexico Biodiversity Webinar Series. I'm Senator Tom Udall and I'm pleased to be the honorary co-host of this series. There are few things more important to our nation than protecting the land that we love and the diversity of the species it sustains for future generations. Thanks to Dr. Banerjee and my friends at UNM for offering this public webinar. And thanks to all of you watching for staying engaged. The challenges we face can feel daunting sometimes, but together we can make a difference. Thank you.
Autumn greetings, everyone. I thank all of you for attending today's webinar. My name is Shubhankar Banerjee. I'm founding director of the Species in Peril project at the University of New Mexico. I am humbled and honored to be serving as co-host with Senator Tom Udall of the UNM Biodiversity Webinar Series this fall that will continue through early December. The Species in Peril project at UNM, Office of Senator Tom Udall, Office of US Representative Dave Haaland, New Mexico Biopark Society, and the Southwest Environmental Center have organized this webinar series, which is originating in New Mexico, the traditional homelands of the indigenous Pueblo, Diné, Apache, and the Ute peoples. The first webinar, Building a National Biodiversity Action Plan, Science, Policy, and the Grassroots, which happened on September 14th, in large part focused on the 30 by 30 initiative that Senator Udall and Congresswoman Haaland have been championing in the US Congress to protect 30% of US land and seas by 2030. We have an encouraging news to share on this. Yesterday, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order to protect 30% of California's state lands and coastal waters by 2030, the first state in the US to support the 30 by 30 initiative, which has so far been adopted by 38 countries. One more news from yesterday. Last evening, a humble fly became social media sensation and has since appeared on media headlines all across the United States and many other countries. It's nice to see so much attention given to a tiny insect. Call it uncanny resonance. The title of today's webinar is Flora, Fishes, and Fireflies, Assessing Species in Peril in New Mexico and Abroad. While our webinar will not fly across social media like the fly did last evening, but it will surely open up our minds to wondrous worlds and new knowledge that is crucially needed for addressing the intensifying biodiversity crisis. I want to thank our friends at the New Mexico Biopark Society for organizing this webinar, which is the second in the series, 2 more to come. Without any further delay, I welcome my dear friend Clayton Meredith, the Species Survival Officer for Plants at the New Mexico Biopark Society, who will moderate the webinar. Clay, take it away.
Thank you, Shubhankar. Welcome, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Shubhankar and the rest of the organizers for putting together this web series. It's been spectacular so far, and I hope that we can live up to the previous iteration. I'm joined today by 3 panelists. First, I have Dr. Kira Milam, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Species Survival Commission. I'm also joined by Topis Contreras McBeath, who is he is head of the Conservation Biology Research Group at the University of Morelos, Mexico, and co-chair of the IUCN Freshwater Conservation Committee. And finally, I have Dr. Sarah Lewis, who is professor of biology at Tufts University in Boston, and the co-chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Firefly Specialist Group. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. I also want to let everyone watching know that we're going to have a brief Q&A at the end of this, and you can submit questions at the very bottom of your screen. There's a little Q&A button. If you click that and submit something, we can hopefully get to some of those questions at the end. Thanks to all of our guests. For a brief introduction to what we're talking about today, the New Mexico Biopark Society 2 years ago began a project with the IUCN. And in partnership with them, we have been working on species level assessments. So last week, during the last webinar, we heard from Senator Udall and Representative Holland that their 30 by 30 proposal to protect large tracts of land and water for the US for the survival of imperiled species. We also heard from Enric Sala about the need to protect the oceans as a whole. We've gone to more or less the opposite end of things in this webinar, and we're going to be discussing the protection of individual species and how assessments of individual species contribute to larger campaigns like that. And I want to begin with Kira and ask why we need to assess these extinction risks and why it's important to have this data, how we gather it, and the ways that it's used. And if you could tell us a little bit more about the Red List.
Sure, thanks, Clay. And let me also start by saying thank you for including me in this panel. It's such a privilege and an honor to be here, and so I appreciate the invitation. I agree. I think the 30 by 30 initiative is wonderful, and having that kind of leadership in the United States is incredible to see. And I really hope that continues to get the same support that it's just recently had in California. I think if we look at the need, if we start by talking about the need to assess not just and to protect and assess not just places, but species, I think it's useful to think about protecting your home. If you're going to protect your home, you want to protect the building, the infrastructure, but you also want to protect the things inside. You want to protect the furniture and probably most importantly, the living things inside it. So the people, your pets, and it's similar with conservation. It's really important to protect areas and ecosystems. The ecosystems are what bring us lots of services and functions and help to create a functioning environment. And by protecting places or spaces, we often protect things within it. But there are lots of species that don't get protection and aren't going to be saved or protected into the future just by protecting the area in which they live. And that's species of plants, animals, and fungi. And if you think of things like with the things that we know a lot about, so things like illegal wildlife trade or disease, those are kinds of things that will threaten species even if those areas are protected. So it's important that in nature conservation, we take both approaches. We protect the big stuff and the little stuff, or the not so little stuff. So the species all the way through to the areas and the ecosystems. And the Red List is a tool that we use to do just that. It's a little bit confusing. It's called the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. Many of you have probably heard about it, but the name itself is a little confusing because it's not really a list and it's not all red. It is a tool that helps us to understand the relative extinction risk faced by species on this planet. And when I say it's not all red, it's a database and it contains lots of different species that have been assessed for their extinction risk, some of which have been found to be common and very commonly occurring and not at risk of extinction, and others right through to the other end of the spectrum, which are critically endangered or extinct in the wild or extinct. And the way that we come across this data is by working with over 9,000 experts in almost every country in the world, who in turn work with their networks to gather information about different species. They take that information and look at things like distribution. Where is it found? How long do they live? What are their threats? How many offspring do they have? How long do they live? And they use that information to calculate the likelihood that that species will go extinct. And then it's placed along a gradient from common to vulnerable to critically endangered and a number of other categories in between. And one other category and then I'll pass over back to you, Clay, is data deficient, which is a really important category as well, because that category tells us that we don't even know enough about that species to know whether it needs protecting. And so the function of the Red List is really to help us to start to understand across the roughly 8.5 million species on the planet, where we need to focus our attention. especially when there are such large threats. There are so many species that need our help. Starting to prioritize our attention and our efforts and our resources is when we turn to the red list to understand which species are more at risk than others. And so that's how we use the red list most commonly.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to emphasize that Senator Udall and Representative Holland talked about the need to prioritize the connectivity of these protected areas. And this is a really great way for us to do that, is by identifying the species that occur there and identifying gaps where there are areas where these things might need to migrate or to have genetic exchange between different areas.
Yeah, and it's the connectivity, but also the prioritization of areas. So one of the factors that's considered when we identify what we in IUCN and our partners call the key biodiversity areas, but also in determining protected areas of all kinds, including marine areas. One of the factors that's taken into account is how biodiverse and how rich the species are there, and also the level of protection or risk of extinction that those species are facing. So yeah.
Yeah, and to that end, Topus, you've done a lot of work with us at the Biopark assessing freshwater fish in Central America. And I sort of jumped into that process towards the end of it. I know you've been working on it for a number of years before that. And when I kind of went back to look at some of your work, one of the things that I noticed is that you've been sort of indirectly measuring how these areas should be protected for a while. And I kind of wanted to ask you how the recent pushes have changed your approaches or the ways that they've informed that.
Yeah, I think as Kira was saying, working with the Red List is, I did it as an independent researcher, but when you work with an organization and you do comprehensive assessment of species, that means all the species of specific group in a region, then you get more robust data, and that with that data you can then plan and implement. So we hadn't done that, and with the help of you and Tim and everybody at the Biopark, we've managed to have this wide assessment of Mexican freshwater fishes, about 536 species now, and recently 227 species from Central America. So this has been really good for us because, as Kira was saying, okay, of course areas are important, but the building blocks of ecosystems are species. And there's this process that's been studied in the past maybe 10 years, which is called defaunation. And that means that you can have a very beautiful forest, but then you don't have all the animals that live in the forest. All those, especially the rare species, they all start disappearing. And then you can still have the trees, but you don't have a functioning ecosystem as it should. So especially when you talk about fish, if you talk about freshwater ecosystems, well, they're important in every aspect, as with all the other species and vertebrates that are and plants are in freshwater ecosystems. Huh? And also, when you mention connectivity, then you have the river systems that it's all connectivity. You can't try to start to define protected areas in a river if you don't work up all the connectivity, or even in a lake, because then you have waters that flow into the lake or flow out of the lake. So it's really complex. It gets really complex, and all the work we've been doing together with you has helped us a lot in getting better idea of what's going on in the region.
Yeah, as I was going through some of your previous work, one of the things that stuck out to me was you have these great maps that you put together of species endemism and richness, and the scale on that is great for what you can do with that. But after we followed through and did the individual species level assessments, you can see how much finer grained that gets, and how these are not directly comparable measures by any stretch of the imagination, but this kind of shows the progression that you can have as you move through these.
Exactly. If you get a finer grain, you can take better decisions. No, it's also you get the same general pattern of, like in those maps, the general pattern are in the same patterns occur in central Mexico, but it's different. Just the scale is different. So the recent work we've done is amazing. It's, taking things to a different level.
Yeah, and while freshwater fish are relatively well studied, as you said, that they're in these constrained habitats. One of the things that I thought was really interesting over the course of the last few months, we've started working with the Firefly Specialist Group with Dr. Sarah Lewis, and I've just been shocked by how little I knew about fireflies over the course of the entire operation. I read your book over the course of the last couple of weeks, and it just blew my mind finding out what fireflies eat. I'd never questioned it before. It had never occurred to me to think of what fireflies eat. And finding out that a lot of them eat snails, just it blew my mind. Who would have thought? And one of the things that struck me was just how little I knew about fireflies. But then as I read more of your work, it struck me how little anyone knows about fireflies, and how poorly studied these are. And one of the things that really got to me was a study that you did this year where you sent out a survey to people. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about how that works.
Absolutely. So yeah, it was really fun to write a book about fireflies because everybody loves them, and a lot of people are curious to know more about them, but there isn't really a lot of popular knowledge about fireflies that's out there. For example, most people don't realize that there's more than 2,000 different firefly species around the world, and they have astoundingly diverse lifestyles and different courtship behaviors and different prey that they eat. And so an important first step for us in trying to understand how to conserve fireflies was to understand what the major threats, what are the major things that fireflies are facing as existential threats to them right now. And so to do this, the IUCN Firefly Specialist Group actually went out and contacted experts from around the world, and we asked them to rank a whole bunch of different threats. And when we gathered all these expert opinions together, so these are people who really know fireflies in their particular region. In every single region, the top threats that emerged were, first of all, loss of suitable habitat, right? So, for example, most fireflies, including some that only occur in the US, in the southwestern US, they rely on permanent wetlands along streams and rivers. And when these water sources dry up or get diverted, the fireflies that live there don't survive. Fireflies they're really lousy at dispersal, and so they can't just pack up and move. The second biggest threat, and this really surprised us, was light pollution. So a lot of fireflies use bioluminescent signals to court. And we now know that bright lights at night obscure these signals and reduce the firefly's ability to find mates. And so light pollution is a really big threat for fireflies. The third major threat that emerged everywhere was pesticides. So fireflies are insects, and as juveniles, they spend up to 2 years living underground. And in the soil, they get exposed to any kinds of broad spectrum insecticides that have accumulated there. So we're now able to combine this information that we gathered on threats to firefly populations with what we already know about firefly behavior and their ecology. And we're beginning now to zero in, with the help of the New Mexico Biopark Society, to zero in on identifying and then protecting the species that have the greatest risk of extinction. So we're at the very beginning of this process, but we're very excited to be working together to conserve endangered firefly species.
Yeah, thank you. It was also fascinating to hear some of the historic threats, which I had no idea that fireflies were collected en masse in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Fireflies have actually, well, insects in general, but fireflies in particular, have been really, really useful to people. And the light producing chemicals that fireflies invented, so these chemicals were invented by fireflies. They've been honed over eons of evolution, and they've been harnessed by humans for to improve human health. So for a long time, the firefly chemicals were actually harvested by collecting them from the wild. So commercial harvesting of wild fireflies was a really big deal in the US during a lot of the 20th century. And they were harvested to extract their light producing chemicals. And those light producing chemicals were used for a whole bunch of different things. Initially for food safety testing. And so the chemicals extracted from fireflies could be used as a sort of light readout, a luminescent readout, to detect good food that's gone bad, microbial contamination of soft drinks and food things. They've been used in biomedical research for testing new cancer-fighting drugs. And right now, firefly chemicals are helping in the fight against COVID-19. So they've been really, really useful in many, many different applications in biomedicine. So fortunately for fireflies now, in the 1990s, these chemicals were synthesized and are now available. Synthetic chemicals are now available. So it's fortunate for fireflies and fans of fireflies that we no longer have to harvest them from the wild. But it was a really big business for a while.
It's just so fascinating, and it overlaps with some of my work with the medicinal plant specialist group, because we also deal with things that are harvested for biomedical research. And you mentioned COVID-19, and that's a huge question mark for us. Is how is the increased demand for traditional Chinese medicine and a lot of other herbal remedies going to impact a lot of these plant species? And for many of them, the answer is we don't know. And in a lot of instances, we're relying on data that's the same sort of anecdotal data that you're relying on for fireflies, with people noting that there are fewer fireflies. In New Mexico in particular, there's a plant that a lot of people might be familiar with, Osha, which is a species of Ligusticum. And if you ask collectors, they'll tell you that it's very nearly extinct, that it's depleted to the point of emergency. And sometimes we have to really balance those anecdotal data. Sometimes that alarm bell can be, absolutely necessary, and that can be the impetus for us to do more. And in other cases, people are harvesting from the same spot all the time. And so we can have these really locally depleted populations, and we can be in a situation where we're really, really concerned about the abundance of a species that is not at all threatened. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to engage in this research and to do these assessments. Let's see. And to kind of expand on what Kira has mentioned with the Red List, to date, there have been more than 120,000 species assessed, which sounds like an awful lot. But when you consider that in terms of the number of described species, which is almost 2 million, we've really only assessed the conservation status and the extinction risk of about 6% of the world's biodiversity. And when you think about all the huge number of species that haven't been described yet, it could be as low as less than 2% of the world's biodiversity has been assessed by this metric. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to assess everything, but we need to have a good idea of what's going on. And sometimes that requires a substantial number of species. We have a goal of 160,000 species by the end of the year to try to get a representative sample that we can use to model the broader biodiversity that's available. I was wondering if Kira wanted to chime in on some of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it is just a drop in the ocean, metaphorically, of the species that are out there, whether they're described or not described yet. But as you say, the effort to try and have 160,000 species assessed by the end of this year is to try and get a representative sample. So to really try and make sure that we've understood what's happening to different types of species in different regions of the world and in different types of habitats, with facing different types of threats. And we're starting to get a good picture. And like most data science, you get to a point where the data starts reinforcing itself and you can get a solid understanding of what's happening. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep striving to understand more species and to understand the extinction threat faced by more species. But we do need to get to a point where we can understand the data enough for it to be enforcing key decisions and things like national biodiversity action plans. So the IUCN has done a lot of science with people much smarter than me and much more familiar with the Red List than I am. Have spent a lot of time understanding where are those tipping points? How many species across what types of taxa, in what types of ranges do we really need to understand before we start getting a fairly comprehensive or complete picture of what's happening to that taxonomic group or within that region, enough to inform protected areas or wider policy decisions or whole biodiversity action strategies. And as Top has referred to before, we have a term called comprehensively assessed, where some groups of species, and in a lot of cases vertebrates fall into that category, we do feel like we need to understand what's happening across all of the species in that taxonomic group, especially when we know that some of the threats are species specific. But we are making a lot of great strides. Just 15 years ago, there was almost no marine species described, other than marine mammals, described on the Red List. We've had a concerted effort with lots of partners from around the world to really start to understand what's happening with the marine, with species in the marine realm. And we now are, by the end of this year, we will have 20,000 species assessed in the Red List. And that crosses vertebrates, so fishes, as well as plants and invertebrates. And so we're starting to get a much clearer understanding of what's happening to species in that realm. But for some, it's really hard. We mentioned that there's so much that's not known about fireflies, despite how charismatic and amazing they are and how visible they are to people. If you go and talk to our fungi scientists, you'll hear a whole nother degree of lack of information and knowledge. And in some cases, there are species of fungi that are bigger than blue whales, that are bigger than whole forest ecosystems, because the fungi exist in the soil and interconnect the entire forest. Yet we know almost nothing about most of those species. There are millions of species of fungi, and as you mentioned, we haven't even started to describe them, let alone understand the risk that they're facing and the influence of things like fungicides and the chemicals that we're using in agriculture. So the types of threats and impact different human behavior, activities are having on some of these species before we even know they exist half the time. So, you know, we're never going to get to a point where we understand intricately the impact we're having on every species on the planet. And the point of the Red List is really to give us kind of an indicator, if you like, of what's happening across large groups of species in representative areas, so that we can start to use that to inform decision making, whether it's at the scientific end, the kind of conservation practice, conservation funding, or right through to legislation. So that's the objective, and I think we're getting close to that. With 160,000 assessed, we're confident that it's now becoming what we call the barometer of life. So really giving us a clear gauge of the state of the world. But one more thing I'll say is that it's not static. We know that. We know that the impacts we're having on nature are substantial and not even, and that it's in some cases changing dramatically. So the one challenge is to assess the extinction risk faced by species. The next challenge is to do it again, so we understand how that's changing for groups of species or individual species or different types of ecosystems over time. Frogs are an example of that. I mean, or corals actually. Corals and frogs are two taxonomic groups that we've seen decline dramatically over the last decade. And it's one thing to know that a taxonomic group is under serious pressure of extinction, but to know that that pressure is getting extremely heightened or worse over time and rapidly, it really sounds those alarm bells in a whole nother way. So I think it's important that we not only undertake red list assessments, but we sustain that effort in the long term and come back and reassess species over 5 to 10 years, so that at least so that we can see what's happening and how dramatic changes are occurring.
And one of those groups that's being comprehensively assessed is the freshwater fish that Topaz has been working on. And I wonder if you could give us an update on how some of that's going.
Yeah, well, it's going great. We've assessed now about half of all the freshwater fish species in the world. And it's about 18,000 species. Just to talk about frogs, it's about 6,500 species, and fish is 18,000. So we've assessed about half the species. We're working, of course, we've done Central America, Mexico. We're doing China, and we're starting to do the Amazon. And the Amazon has about 4,000 species of freshwater fishes. And so we expect to finish by the end of next year the whole freshwater fish assessments. And you know, so it's been a lot of work, but I think we need to do it because, you know, fishes are not that charismatic. You know, yeah, well, some are really nice and you have it in aquariums, and a lot of people like to go fishing, and they like trout and they like bass. But there's a lot of other species that are really interesting. And apart from the fact that fishes are really important for ecosystems, for freshwater ecosystems, they're also important for livelihoods. So about 2 billion people in the world, 2 billion, obtain their primary animal protein from freshwater fishes. And that's a lot, 2 billion people. So if we kill all the fishes, what are these people going to eat with regards to animal protein? And they don't have to buy this animal protein. They just go to the river and they fish, and now they have something to eat. So that's another aspect that's really important about assessing the fishes. We need to know how they are, how their populations are, which is really difficult for fishes. We don't know much about population status in most of the species, but we're getting there. I think we're making really great advances.
And can I quickly ask Topaz a question, Clay? Topaz, does the finish line keep moving for you? I know that, I mean, Clay mentioned that so many species are undescribed, and that we're really just trying to assess the described species. I know that for amphibians, I am close friends with the person that's coordinating the amphibian assessments, and she says that every year 100 new species are being described. So they keep thinking they're close to that target, and then more species are described. So is the same thing happening with you with freshwater fishes?
Yeah. For the past maybe 8 years, about 500 new species are described every year. 500
every year?
Yeah, every year. There's some marine ones, but most of them are freshwater species because there's a lot of diversity in little streams and small lakes. You know, if you go to tropical areas, it's incredible the number of species that they're describing everywhere. So yeah, it keeps moving, but we're getting there. I mean, we're working very hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the really major accomplishments of that has been the Mexico assessment that you were instrumental in helping to organize, and it was hosted here at the biopark. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about the threats to species in Mexico and how the project went.
Yeah, it was really great. You know, especially Tim Lyons from the biopark did a lot of work in this project, but we managed to gather you know, the best Mexican ichthyologists over there at the biopark, and a lot of other ones from the United States, and we did the assessment, and about 40% of the species are threatened. And if we look at about how we're doing in a global assessment, about 23% globally are threatened. So there's a lot of threatened species in Mexico. It's about the same number that there are threatened in Europe. But we have about 20 extinct freshwater fishes in Mexico. And so that's really bad. I mean, so that's about maybe 4%. And globally, it's 1% of the species have gone extinct. So the situation in Mexico is not that good. With regards to Central America, it's about 35 or something percent. We're still working on that assessment, but they have no extinct species in Central America. So yeah, the situation is not that good in the region.
And with regards to that idea that there's a moving finish line, that's one thing for amphibians and for freshwater fish, but that's a whole wildly different prospect for insects. And I can't even begin to imagine how complex that is for invertebrate groups, especially with fireflies and things like that. And I wondered if you could fill us in on some of the need to do more assessments, Sarah.
Yeah, sure. You know, it's hard to study insects sometimes because, you know, they're kind of small and a lot of people hate insects. And certainly the IUCN has done a fabulous job assessing extinction risk for, you know, lovable, charismatic groups like birds. It's great that 100% of bird species have been evaluated, and mammals, like more than 90% of mammals have been evaluated on the red list. But it's important to keep in mind that invertebrates actually make up about 97% of all animal species that currently live on our planet. And, you know, even though they don't have backbones and they're often like really tiny, they are, by people who love them, they're known as the little things that run the world. Unfortunately, these little things often get overlooked in conservation efforts. And insects in particular are drastically underrepresented on the red list. About, well, less than 1% of all known insect species have been assessed so far. I'm happy to say, though, that a number of specialist groups, scientists from all over the world, are working really, really hard to improve the situation, including really comprehensive assessments that have either recently been completed or are currently underway for bumblebees, for butterflies, for dragonflies. And thanks to the New Mexico Biopark Society and Anna Walker, we have begun to assess the US fireflies. About 150 species of US fireflies are going to be hopefully on the next edition of the Red List. So a lot of progress is being made on a bunch of different insects.
That's fabulous, but there's just such a huge like mountain to climb there. There's so many species, and it's mind-boggling to me when I look at the 400,000 species of plants worldwide, to just imagine, you know, there's many times that many insects, and fewer people working on them. It's just incredible, and especially in light of these widespread declines that we're seeing in insect populations all over the world, we don't have an idea of what impact that has on a species level.
And I think your point just then, Clay, is a really important one. The fewer people working on them, I mean, we really need more researchers on these underrepresented species. We need to know more about them. So we need more students that are focusing in on invertebrates and on plants and on freshwater fishes. It's so critical. We have so many people in the conservation community working on the big stuff. And we really need to see more students and more conservationists coming through that are focusing on, as Sarah said, the little guys that make the world go round, both plants and fungi and invertebrates.
Yeah, and a big part of that is citizen science initiatives. So one of the major issues that we have when I go to assess a species, I look at the scientific literature that's published about it, and I might dig through an herbarium and find a few specimens that have been collected by scientists. But if I get on iNaturalist or Flickr, I can find thousands of photos, and I can get a much better idea of where these species exist and where they occur. And so there's so many of these initiatives that the public can participate in, and it's as simple as going for a walk around your neighborhood and taking pictures of the plants or insects that you see, and uploading them. And it can have such a massive impact on the world around you, especially with some of these understudied species. And one thing that really strikes me is how many of these initiatives exist. So I've worked primarily with iNaturalist, and I submit things to that all the time. I wander around my neighborhood and say, what is this plant or what is this bug? And upload those. And it's great because it's not just the data on where things are. It's also, I can see the picture, I can see what someone uploaded. And that helps us to measure things like climate change in the long run, because we can see that flowers are blooming earlier than they were before. And that can help us contextualize things and figure out what the threats are to these species. But iNaturalist is just one of these. Anna and Sarah have told me about some of the insect ones, and for the life of me, I don't remember them because I'm so hung up on my plants. But I wonder if you could tell us a few of those that people might be interested in.
Yeah, sure. There's actually there's a number of different citizen science. You're exactly right. Citizen science is a huge boon for collecting not only data on the distribution of species, but also long-term population trends in species. And, you know, instead of having a few scientists, specialists scattered here and there across a region, to have, you know, hundreds and in some cases thousands of citizen scientists recording data from their backyard or their neighborhood park, it's really great. So we've been working with the IUCN Firefly Specialist Group has been working with a citizen science initiative called Firefly Watch, and it's based in Massachusetts, but there's something like about 4,000 participants around the US and Canada, and people are, and it's really exciting because people are going out in their backyard, they're recording the flash patterns, they're taking pictures of the fireflies, and they're reporting a measure of the relative abundance of these species in one particular location and at one particular time. And so by doing this year after year after year, and Firefly Watch has now been going on for about 10 years, we can begin to get information about how species abundances are changing. We are also, there's many other countries actually also, fireflies are cool, right? Because they're really conspicuous, and one way that you can measure their abundance, you don't have to, like, you know, catch them with a net, you can actually count the number of flashes per unit time. And so there's a number of different initiatives all over the world where people have been keeping track of firefly populations in Spain, in Malaysia, in Thailand. And so our specialist group is now trying to combine all of these efforts and have a centralized database for all firefly citizen science data that we can use to track these trends in populations. So it's really exciting, and I would encourage anybody who loves fireflies and is willing to go out just like once a week for 5 or 10 minutes during the firefly season to count flashes in their backyard. Check it out, Firefly Watch.
Can I mention a really fun example that they did at in Panama? They asked people to record frog calls, and they got you know, recordings from all over the world, and with those, they managed to find, I think, 6 species that thought to be extinct, and just because of call. I mean, it's incredible, all the things you can do with the help of citizens. And I know Sarah must know more about this than me, but I think they managed to work out the whole migration patterns of the monarch butterflies with thousands of records from iNaturalist for the butterflies. So they know now where they sleep and what they eat, and that would have taken a team of entomologists maybe years to do it. And they did it really fast because all the help from citizens. So I think that that's a really important tool.
Yeah, we're also setting some of these up at the biopark right now. So one of the ones that we're working with is a butterfly monitoring scheme that my colleague Anna Walker is working on. And it's just, every time she describes it, I get super jealous that I didn't go into entomology instead of plants, because she tells me about just wandering around looking at butterflies, and you go every other week for the duration of the summer and walk around and look at butterflies. And I just imagine, you know, running around with a net, and it's just so such a beautiful image. But we're working to set that up here. So we're actually going to be recruiting volunteers over the next year to take on one of these routes and to walk around right here in Albuquerque to look at and monitor these butterflies so that we can get a better idea of their migration patterns and what invasive plants that they land on. That's a really big deal that Anna was talking to me about just today, which is she'll go to these areas and expect to find no butterflies because it's full of invasive weeds. And she'll find just a huge diversity of butterflies. And it's really important to know that so that we can really target our efforts towards modifying these habitats or restoring these habitats in ways that are effective rather than investing a lot of time in getting rid of sweet clover when it's fine and it doesn't really have too much of an impact. I've kind of buried the lead here in talking about the biopark. I'm broadcasting from the biopark right now, which is a zoo and an aquarium, and a lot of people have this this image of the conservation efforts that are happening at zoos and aquariums and botanic gardens, in that it's public outreach or that we're specifically breeding these species on site, and some of that is exactly what we do, but some of it's not. And the biopark is funded in large measure, or the New Mexico Biopark Society pays for my position. And one of the things that comes with that is that you have the opportunity to help us out. And so I want to show you a picture that this is one of my favorite pictures that I have ever taken. And I took this last week on my way to film some fishes, which I hope Topaz can talk about in just a moment. But here you see on the right side there's one of our Christmas light installations for the River of Lights display that we have every year. And on just behind it there, you can see a scrubby looking little weed with a beautiful white flower. That flower is the Sacramento prickly poppy. It's one of the rarest plants in New Mexico, and it's one that we house and we keep on Poppy Hill. It's a reservoir population that we can draw seeds from that we can use for reseeding initiatives and to help the species in the wild. And what's great about this photo is that you can see the funding source that helps save this species is right there in the foreground. But also this is a species that thrives on disturbance. So it loves disturbance, and the seeds will not grow unless the soil is destroyed or wrecked or stepped on. And one of the ways that we can mimic this disturbance is by setting up a Christmas light display on it every year. And so this is the perfect intersection of all of our efforts is happening in just this one photo. And speaking of those fishes, maybe Topaz wants to talk about some of our collections.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the split fins. You have the Mexican freshwater fishes. They're from the Godate family, which is an endemic family of fishes with about 43 species. Some are already extinct in the wild. And so it's really great that you have these specimens. All of them, well, maybe 90% are threatened. And that's a really big part of the conservation that zoos and aquariums can do, keep populations, healthy populations. With these small fishes, it's not that hard because they don't need a lot of space. It's not like having a healthy population of elephants or something. And while we try to restore the places where they live, sometime in the near future, maybe we can bring them back to the natural habitat. We've done this with one of the species, Sogonecticus tequila, which it's really emblematic of Mexico because it's named tequila, so we need to preserve it. It was extinct in the wild, and a colleague of mine from the University of Michoacan has restored the site where it was last seen, and he has now reintroduced some specimens, and it's in the first stages of the reintroduction, but that species was saved because some aquarium keeper liked the fish. They took it to Germany, and then from Germany they took it to Britain, and then from Britain they gave it to me, and I gave it to him, and now they're back in the wild. But imagine with the knowledge that you have at zoos and aquariums who have experts in maintaining and breeding and doing genetic management of the species, that could be really easier. It's not like one aquarium just have a couple of small aquariums with the species. You have the facilities. And you also could do the outreach part, which is we talked about when I was there, which is really important. I mean, those fishes are really nice, and you can help a lot in making a case for these least known species that are really important, and they're extinct in the wild and they're endemics, and we need to try to get them back in the wild. So I think you guys are doing a great job with these fishes, and we're really grateful because, you know, of the fishes we assessed in Mexico, a little over 500 species, about 300 are endemic. So we have to protect our endemic species. Some we share with the United States, but we have about 300 endemics, and many of those are threatened. So it's really interesting that people from outside the country like you are helping us in doing conservation of the species, and we're very grateful for that.
Yeah, it's also really fortuitous because this partnership that Kira has helped develop, where we're working on these species, can help us identify situations where this can come about. And I think I'll let Kira speak more on that.
Sure. I think Clay. I think Topaz then really described well the different roles that zoos and aquariums and botanic gardens can play in species conservation. To be honest, I think all of those institutions. So and the biopark happens to represent all three of them: a botanic garden, an aquarium, and a zoo. Are really the silent, too often forgotten heroes of species conservation. And not just for visitors, not just for the communities that mostly think of zoos, aquariums, and botanic gardens as places to spend a fun Saturday with your family and go and see some animals and some plants. Also, the conservation community too often forgets just the amount of expertise that is in these institutions and the incredible facilities and opportunities that they provide. We often forget that the staff in zoos, aquariums, and botanic gardens spend more time with these species than they do with their own families. They know how to care for them. They understand them in a deep, rich way that most people that study these species in the wild don't get the opportunity to learn. I know lots of researchers that have spent their entire career in the wild working on species and have maybe seen them 3 times. And so the expertise that exists within these organizations is phenomenal. And so are the programs. So increasingly good accredited zoos and aquariums around the world are doing lots of work to save species. And when people think about the work they're doing, often they think just about, okay, maybe they support a program in the wild. They send money to a program in the wild to help someone else to do conservation half a world away. Or maybe they breed some species and eventually might put some of them back in the wild. But I think what we're trying to do, and what the Biopark Partnership is such an amazing example of, is to bring experts together from all these different fields, from governments, from field scientists, from universities, and from zoos and aquariums and botanic gardens, to look at how, and to citizen science, to look at how different skill sets, different perspectives, different knowledge can work together to understand the extinction threat faced by species, but then to go well beyond that as well. So one thing that I haven't said yet tonight that is often leveled at IUCN and the Red List efforts is that it's occasionally criticized as just documenting decline, that we're just pulling all this information together to watch which species are going to go extinct. And that's really not what we're doing. All of us are in this game because we want to save species, and it's a tool to help us do that. But it only does that if we take it to the next step. And I think you've just given some examples tonight, and this partnership is really helping to do this for some key species, is to take that information, bring together different types of experts, and develop an action plan to figure out, okay, well, how do we use our unique skills, our unique strengths, bring them together to work as a team, stop playing with half our team on the bench, but bring them in and figure out what we need to do to save these species, and then make sure we work with governments and funders and everyone that we can, including communities, to make that happen. And so like I said, the biopark has been an incredible model for how we do this. We've only been doing this with you guys for 2 years, and already it's had such an amazing impact, and really brought whole communities of scientists and the zoo, aquarium, and botanic garden, and a lot of your wider audiences together. And like we've seen, had some really big impacts on particular species, like those fishes that are really have now a concrete plan and a vision to get them back in the wild and thriving. But potentially even more exciting is that we now want to take what we've learned with the partnership with the biopark and work with other zoos, aquariums, botanic gardens, museums, and universities around the world to take a similar approach. We would love to have a partnership like the biopark in every state of the US. We would love to have a partnership like the one with the biopark on every continent on the planet and every country eventually, so that we can all be working more on the same team and with the kind of capacity that we need to be able to assess, to plan, and to take action to save species. And so we're, I know that I will show a video a little bit later on, but we're starting an initiative that the Biopark Partnership has really been at the center of, called Reverse the Red, which is about acknowledging the red list. It's about acknowledging the fact that the status of species on the red list is getting worse. But at the end of the day, we know how to save species. We do. There are many species that have been brought back, that have recovered. We know how to do it. We just need to do more of it. We need to do it more together, and we need to do it more strategically and informed by science. And so what we want to do is work together to reverse the red, to reverse the trends that we're seeing on the red list over the next decade. And so take these lessons that we're learning through this partnership and emulate them around the world, so that we can work with different countries and different states to really reverse these trends in the same way you're doing for some of the species we've talked about tonight, which is really exciting. So thank you for the model that you've led and for this incredible partnership that's leading the way.
Yeah, and I do think that this is just a start. And I think one thing that's really, really important to recognize is that there are so many communities that we would love to work with in the future, and there are so many more opportunities for engagement, both locally and abroad. And one of those that came to mind during the last webinar, when Congresswoman Holland mentioned the need for tribal governments to join and sign the Convention on Biological Diversity. That's something that we've talked about in our office on numerous occasions. And the Red List feeds into a lot of these international treaties and has benchmarks that are measurable, so that you can meet the obligations in these treaties, but also just measure successes to demonstrate that we can do these things together. And on behalf of the Biopark Society and the Biopark in general, I'd like to extend our hand to anyone who wants to join the CBD, and to any of these tribal governments who would like to sign these treaties. We can help. There's so much that we can do to assist with the Red List process. And we're willing to generate those Red List assessments at the national level for these entities, so that people can have a voice, and to also offer training. And part of the things that we've been working on for the last year has been a partnership with Southwest Indian Polytechnic Institute here in Albuquerque. One of our big goals for that was to let students assess the species on their own lands. So we gave them the training that was necessary to do the assessments. They went out and did the research. And I'm working on getting reviewers right now so that we can get those published, so that students can publish exactly what they know about, and they can publish things with the information that they know and the cultural knowledge that comes with that, which I think is really an incredible addition to the Red List. But it's also what needs to happen in the future for these partnerships. There's no way that I can dictate what the conservation status is of species on tribal lands in New Mexico. It has to be a collaborative process, and we're willing to offer training in that capacity, and also logistical support in any way that we can.
If I can mention something, I think that's a really important point, because when we talk about these big international treaties, we're always thinking about national governments, and sometimes our national governments don't take the right decisions. And when you talk about species conservation or area conservation, it all happens at the local level, and the land has owners sometimes, no, or belongs to tribes or to local communities. And so instead of thinking about just the national government, we need to think about local entities taking decisions that if you sum up the decisions of a lot of these local representatives, you can get much more effective conservation on the ground going on. Then sometimes, they sign it at the national level and nobody does anything on the ground, but it's really at a local level, you can have much more effective results.
And the knowledge as well, Topaz. I mean, I mentioned before that we often overlook the fact that the zookeepers and botanic garden employees and aquarists spend so much time with the species that they care for. I mean, if you're talking about tribal lands, these tribes know that land better than anyone. They've lived on it for generations often, and understand not just the land as it is now and the species that are on it now, but often kind of going back as well. And so there's a generational knowledge there, as well as a community knowledge that is so rich and so important for us to understand if we're going to understand how to save these species. And so, I mean, you were just offering a hand of support, and I think it's like anything, and I know that this is what you meant, but it's like anything, our ability to pool those skills and bring everyone together in that team is so critical when it comes to working with traditional owners. And I think working with tribal lands and tribal communities to really understand, again, that assess, plan, act process, and empowering, and like working together to be empowered as a whole team, to look at where are our different skills, where are our different abilities, but who knows this land best and these species best, and who can make that, like, not just use that knowledge to inform those big picture decisions, but then to make the actions happen on the ground to save those species in reality. And so I'm so incredibly excited about that potential, and would love to do anything as well to support an initiative like that.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal program, and we're committed to continuing our partnership with SIPI and to continuing these training programs. And what we want more than anything is just to expand them, and to make sure that as Kira said, the people who know these organisms the best are going to have a hand in their conservation and take the lead in it, so that we can support them in any way possible, but without dictating the terms.
And one thing I think, I talk about bearing the lead and waiting till 3/4 of the way through to describe the biopark. We haven't really described the IUCN, and I won't go too far into it because it's a giant complex web of an organization. But just to say, the IUCN stands for the International Union for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Say that way too many times. But the reason I bring it up is just because it's one of the very few organizations in the world where this union is comprised of different members. And it's a forum in which heads of state, so the heads of state agencies of the US and other countries around the world, sit alongside representatives from NGOs, so heads of WWF and Nature Conservancy and National Geographic, but also sit alongside representatives from traditional owners. And they all have an equal voice. They have, they're represented in the conversation, in the decision making, and we have a reasonably new category of membership within IUCN, which is specifically for traditional owners. And so it's really important to engage. I know you were talking in the last webinar about international policy platforms like the Convention on Biological Diversity, but IUCN is another key forum where it's really important to have these diversity of voices. But there's room for those voices to sit right alongside those heads of state that Topaz was talking about before. So it's an exciting place for those discussions to happen as well, for anyone that wanted to hear a little more about who IUCN is.
Yeah, and with that, I think I'm going to segue into questions really quickly, because there's a very relevant one that just came up. And that's, what are the benefits of signing the CBD? And that's an incredibly important point, is because it's not just a restrictive measure that limits your access to resources. One of the really major benefits of joining the CBD is that it comes with intellectual property protections. So if you have genetic resources on your land that turn out to be of value to industry or something like that, those resources are protected for signatories of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I think Kira can speak to this with much more detail than I can, because I am relatively new to this, but that's the one that really comes to mind for me, is that especially with medicinal plants and things like that, some of these resources can be extremely valuable, and we don't know what they are. And protecting that bond to the land and protecting the resources that these governments are protecting themselves is really important.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll throw to Topas as well, because I'm sure Topas has a lot. Actually, yeah, Topas, do you want to go first, and then I'll add to it about the value of CBD. And
Well, also the value is that when you sign it, you're part of this global movement. As Kara said, that where you have dignitaries, you have countries, you have regions, all working towards a common goal, which is to protect biodiversity, to value the benefits, and those benefits have to go to local people, the traditional knowledge, which is now recognized by the CBD, and and you get also the support of all these incredible experts that are working on doing the planning of how you should manage the things. Also, I mean, it's like being part of a community that's interested in the preservation of nature. I mean, I think that's a real big thing about the CBD.
yeah, I think it's an extension of everything else we've talked about tonight. It's about saying, if we recognize that human well-being and human livelihoods and the functioning of our society relies on healthy nature, or if you just value nature for nature's sake and are invested in its survival, like many of us are, then we need to do everything we can to work as efficiently and as effectively to achieve species survival in the long term, and broader than that, ecosystem and kind of more nature conservation. And if we're going to do that effectively, we have to work as a team, whether it's between the Biopark Partnership and the SSC that we've spent most of tonight talking about, or whether it's at an international scale at CBD, where countries come together and set targets and push each other and share knowledge and develop mechanisms to protect the kind of units that need protecting and to move forward as a global community. I think it's really just an extension of the partnership we have between SSC and the Biopark. And it makes all of our work more efficient and effective, so it makes our efforts go a lot further as well.
Thank you. There's also another question here. This one's for Kira as well. But where else is the IUCN connecting with the zoo and aquarium community? And what can community members do to help support it?
Sorry, and what members?
What can community members do to help?
Community members, okay. So we are connecting with zoos and aquariums in lots of different countries around the world, especially accredited zoos and aquariums. So there are, I'm a council advisor to the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums that has members in over 80 countries around the world. And we're actively partnering with zoos in, I don't know offhand, but in at least 20 different countries. And we work a lot through Europe and North America, but increasingly working with zoos in Australia, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. But we are careful to work with accredited high standard zoos. And we also are working with botanic gardens and aquariums. When I say zoos, sorry, I mean zoos and aquariums. And what community members can do is, well, I'm going to be really candid here, I think, is visit your zoos and aquariums. Recognize that especially if you're going to good quality accredited zoos and aquariums, that you can read on their website, or you can hear at their keeper talks that they're doing something for conservation, then support them. Go to their events, spend money if you can, or just go and visit them, tell your friends to go and visit them. And if you hear people being critical of zoos and aquariums, distinguish between the fact that there are good ones and there are bad ones. And the good ones are critical for saving species around the world. They're great places to spend time with your family and for people in cities to learn about wildlife that they might not ever see. But for us in the game of saving species, for many, many species, they will be the difference between whether or not those species go extinct. And so be a voice for the good zoos and aquariums and botanic gardens around the world and how critical they are. And then if you can, become a member of your local zoo and take your family there. That's, I think, the simplest thing.
Thanks. I've got a question for Sarah about local fireflies, and I will spare you the gory details of very local geography. But I do have, people are seeing fireflies and they haven't seen them since, or they haven't seen them in a long time. And the question is just, are there any species of fireflies native to the Southwestern United States? And can people in the Southwest get involved with something like Firefly Watch?
Yes, great question. Thank you. That's awesome. So there are actually several species of firefly that are native to the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas. And so it's very exciting that you're seeing them. They are not always very apparent. I've described some of the threats that there's a prolonged drought. It can be not so good for local firefly populations, but if you are seeing fireflies, I would encourage you to get in touch with, well, actually you can report it on iNaturalist. You can also get in touch with Firefly Watch, and more importantly, locally, I think that Anna Walker at the New Mexico Biopark Society would be so excited to hear from you, and we can actually put her contact information maybe in the chat or something, because she has been really, really instrumental in our work on assessing the conservation status of US fireflies, and she's very, very interested in knowing about occurrences of these pretty rare species that are only found in Arizona and New Mexico. So she'd love to hear from you.
I apologize to Anna in advance. I just publicly disclosed her email to all the attendees. Send all of your firefly questions to Anna. I also have there's a question here for Topaz about how freshwater fishes have been protected historically, and are aquatic habitats typically considered when protected areas are being established? Yeah, I think you're muted.
Yes, well, not really. They haven't been that protected, you know, as terrestrial organisms. Some species, those are highly threatened, are in U.S. in the Endangered Species Act. In Mexico, we have our own Species Act, and they're protected there. But with regards to protected areas, you can have the best national park or wetland, and most of them are stocked with invasive species, fishes, mainly for anglers. So there's no correlation between terrestrial protected areas and endangered fishes, and that's a thing we're working on at the Freshwater Conservation Committee, trying to work more with regards to freshwater protected areas, with a specific view on protected areas that goes beyond Ramsar and those areas, which are really interesting, very important, but are based on aquatic birds. So you can have the aquatic birds, but then you are missing all the freshwater species and the crabs and the crayfish, which are all threatened. I mean, if fishes are threatened, crabs, crayfish, mollusks, about 80% of all the freshwater mollusks are threatened, which is terrible. So yeah, there's not a correlation, and we haven't done a good job on that. Not anywhere in the world. I mean, it's terrible. The situation is really bad.
Yeah, and that's especially important with reference to the connectivity that we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
especially with river systems being so interconnected that you can have small portions of a stream are protected, but if the headwaters and everything downstream is not protected, then it means so little.
And there's some really good example about regarding river restoration, like River Rhine in Europe. That's a river that it's a huge river that crosses 11 countries. It's a river that's in you know, goes through Germany, through the Netherlands, and which is the biggest industrial region in Europe. And maybe in the 70s, it was terribly polluted. There was practically no freshwater life there. And in recent years, salmon are running up the river now. So you can bring back freshwater ecosystems. Technically, it can be done really easily. You need a lot of money, but you can do it. And yeah, we need to do more into freshwater ecosystem restoration, considering all this connectivity you were mentioning.
Yeah. I've also got a question here. There's apparently some students watching. And someone's asking, how as students can we curb the biodiversity crisis? And I'd say that if you were a student watching this, email me and I would be happy to make sure that you're included in the next training so that we can get you writing some of these assessments. It doesn't take a whole lot of expertise to contribute to these. We do rely on experts for review to make sure that we're using the highest quality data available. But compiling this data can be really, really time consuming. And this is one of the tasks that I do. I'm not a botanist by trade. And so it really helps to have botanists be able to have, you know, a partially completed assessment when I bring it to them and I say, here's to the best of my knowledge where we're at. And having students contribute to those is always helpful. So one of the great ways that you can do this is to reach out to organizations like the Biopark and find out how you can help. And some of that can be as simple as citizen science initiatives, just download iNaturalist and go out and take pictures of stuff, which it sounds so simple, but it's incredibly helpful. And it can be as complex as joining one of our butterfly monitoring schemes and helping to monitor these populations of lepidopterans all throughout our state.
Well, Clay stopped short of where I would have gone. Clay said it could be as complex as joining a butterfly monitoring program. I was going to say, or it could be as complex as changing your career path to becoming an ichthyologist or an entomologist and going and studying invertebrates or freshwater fishes or fungi, and really kind of join this community that's trying to understand more about this species that so few people know about. Sorry to interrupt you, Clay. I was just going to push this a little further.
Please. Yeah, and there's so much opportunity for that because this is a global crisis. This is not something that respects borders. This is not something that respects any sort of political divisions. Everywhere you go, the biodiversity crisis is there. And so we really do need to get a handle on this and yeah, consider it. It's a really fun job.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that very last point you made of it's a very fun job. I think we have to use terms like crisis and we have to talk about the scale of the challenge because that's the reality. I mean, we are losing species, but I feel it, that there are so many catastrophes around us at the moment that it can become quite overwhelming. And I think it's important with the biodiversity situation to acknowledge that we can turn it around. We really can. I think there is so much cause for optimism. I think we do need to ask the question of, well, how can I get involved? How can I help? What are the small changes I might be able to make, or how could my career make a difference? Or how can my vote help? Or how can I ask to make sure that my politicians on both sides of the aisle care about the environment and about saving species? Because I just wanted to emphasize that I think there is cause for optimism. I think so often we hear kind of crisis and these terrifying numbers of the state of nature. But we're in this game because we believe we can make a difference, and I genuinely believe that. I think we already are turning around the situation for lots of species and lots of areas around the world. And the more we can have legislation that pushes for things like 30/30 to protect large parts of our planet, and the more we can use tools like the Red List to really understand where our efforts are most needed and do something about it, and have partnerships like the one at the Biopark and the SSE that bring our skills together to make a difference. I have lots of cause for hope for the future. So,
I also wanted to just follow up on that to say that there is one of the great things about the IUCN Red List is that we can actually distinguish between species that really need our attention and species that are doing really well. So we've discovered just in the past few years that there is, and by assessing firefly species in the US, some firefly species are doing really, really well. There's a question in the chat from somebody who lives in Maryland and sees fireflies in June and July. Those fireflies are probably the Big Dipper fireflies, which are all over the east coast of the United States, all the way from Massachusetts down to Florida, Mississippi, and they're doing really well. So there's cause, you know, it's really great when we can say, okay, well, this firefly is doing really well. We don't need to, it's not a habitat specialist. It can live pretty much anywhere, and it will probably always be around for people to enjoy. We can really then put our effort into protecting fireflies that have much more limited distributions, like the ones in Arizona and New Mexico, and making sure that we can conserve their habitat. So there's cause for optimism for sure.
Yeah, and following up on that, there's this big movement called conservation optimism, which is trying to focus on the success stories. And I think that's where the biopark also can help us a lot. And zoos and aquariums can be those places where we can tell the, the real situation, but also talk about these success stories. There's a lot of them all around the world, no? I was for about 8 years a part of the evaluating committee of the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund, and we fund, just for fish, we funded about 100 projects, little projects with really good success outcomes. And so as Sarah and Kira said, that there's some really good stories out there that we need also to communicate. And I think it's a big part of what we need to do during this current situation we're living. Talk a little bit more about the success stories.
That's a really great idea, Topaz. And in fact, that's exactly what we're trying to do with Reverse the Red, the initiative I mentioned a little earlier. It's the partnership that's being started by the Species Survival Commission in partnership with the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And at this stage, already 20 leading zoos and aquariums around the world, including the Biopark, as well as Smithsonian, San Diego Zoo, many other zoos from other countries. And we're right at the moment, we're pulling together lots of different success stories that we can celebrate. And in a week or two, we're going to launch a new website, and we're going to be working with governments, with zoos, aquariums, and botanic gardens and museums and the expert networks around the world to not just celebrate the success stories, but to help move forward more of those and turn around the trajectory for more species. And so we're really excited about that initiative. So watch this space, and I can't point you to a website just yet, but in a week or two, Google Reverse the Red and you'll find us.
Thank you for that. And we're running out of time, so I think I'm gonna close things up. And I want to thank all three of our panelists, Kira Milam, Sarah Lewis, and Topaz Contreras McVeigh. Thank you all so much for your contributions to this. It's been really great to chat with you all. I also want to let everyone know, remind everyone that we have another webinar coming up next month. And I've lost the capacity to share my screen, which I guess is good that it happened at the very last minute. There it is. So yeah, I would like to ask everyone to join us for the next webinar in the series, which is on Indigenous kinship and multi-species justice, hosted by Ilsbeth Aralu, and that'll be Thursday, November 19th. I am so excited to see this one. It's going to really expand upon a lot of the points that have been made in the first two and bring a perspective that is very much needed to this conversation. So I want to thank our organizers for putting this together. And I'm going to close with a brief video on the Reverse the Red project that Kira just mentioned. So again, thank everyone for attending. I really appreciate your time and your attention. It's been really great to have this conversation.
Thanks, Clay, and thanks everyone who attended.
Thank you, thank everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Every year, thousands of experts evaluate the status of animal, plant, algae, and fungi species around the world. Using a common language of assessment, they categorize each species' risk of extinction on the IUCN Red List. The Red List provides a barometer of life. And every year, the outlook gets worse. More than 31,000 species are currently threatened with extinction. Most because of human action. But human action can also reverse the Red List trend. So conservationists, governments, and communities around the world are joining forces, activating tried and tested IUCN tools in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can win the fight for our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
Do we all just hang up now?
Is there anybody out there?
Hello, hello.
Oh.
Anka, did you fall asleep?